Well, thank you. And actually, you've done a great job of answering most of the questions I would have asked, but just a couple, if I could. The chemicals that you have referred to in your testimony as being problematic for unborn children, is it in any way possible that they come from some other source than brominated flame retardants?
No. No, these are brominated flame retardants are synthetic chemicals. They did not exist on the surface of the earth until they were created by the chemical industry.
So the source of the problem you've described is them?
Yes.
Okay. And you've told us, if I understood correctly, that once it causes problems in unborn children, those problems are not correctable or repairable.
At least not in the case of brain damage. That's correct.
Once a child is born, is that child also, up to some age, subject to additional medical problems as a result of exposure to those flame retardants?
Yes, the child is. And the reason for that is that, as we all know from our daily experience, children continue to grow all through childhood. The brain goes through its most rapid and complex growth in the 9 months before birth, but that growth, development, and further remodeling of the brain structures continues all through up to adolescence and even into adult life to a lesser extent. And so very specifically in the case of brominated flame retardants, the fact that nursing infants in the first 3 to 6 months of life in this country are exposed to very, very high levels of brominated flame retardants in breast milk. The chemistry is such that these compounds concentrate in fatty tissue. Human breast milk has a high fat content, and so brominated flame retardants reach far higher concentrations in mother's milk than in blood or serum.
What sorts of health issues might you expect to find then in children who have been born and up to adolescence, let's say, which seems to be the dividing line, you think, roughly?
More or less, yeah.
Beyond that, as adults, they're not quite, it takes, maybe larger concentrations or to create a problem in an adult?
For most of the chemicals that I've studied, that's the situation, yes. That it takes higher doses of the compound to cause damage in adults compared to children, and then children in the womb are the most sensitive of all. In other words, there's a gradient.
Okay. What sorts of health issues would you expect to find in younger children, and what sorts of health issues would you expect to find in adults?
It's been, I'm not aware that the brominated flame retardants have been, it's close, that I'm not aware that studies of effects in childhood have been studied as carefully as the exposures before birth. But logically, it would seem to me that you'd see the same kind of effects, although perhaps to lesser severity.
Okay, and the same thing would be true for adults then?
Yes.
You heard the industry folks testify about weight of the evidence, which I guess could mean different things to different people. What standard would you employ in making these kinds of decisions? You certainly have the medical background. There's a lot of scientific evidence. There's all sorts of studies that have been done on this issue. Do you think the weight of the evidence, to use their standard, that's out there argues in favor of prohibiting these chemicals?
Yes, I do. The evidence is not complete. It never will be. It's not complete even today for lead or for asbestos, for that matter. But in the case of brominated flame retardants, there's abundant evidence from animal studies, experimental animal studies, from human epidemiologic studies. The most sensitive human studies, such as the one that was conducted by my colleagues at Columbia, are what are called prospective birth cohort epidemiologic studies. And the way these studies work is they enroll women during pregnancy, take a history from each mom in the study, get blood samples, urine samples from her, and analyze them very carefully for a whole range of chemicals, get cord blood from the baby at the time of birth, and then follow the children as they grow up and do careful examinations at preset intervals, like 1 year, 3 years, 6 years, and so on as the child grows up. And when you do this kind of a prospective study where you've measured early exposure in real time back when it was actually occurring, and then you have somebody doing the psychometric assessment at age 6 who knows nothing about the chemical level, so the two investigators are blind to each other. It's a very powerful, very robust study for assessing causal associations between early exposures and later outcomes. And we've got studies that find that PBDEs cause loss of intelligence, a finding that is entirely analogous to what we saw lead doing.
If you could, because I don't think we've had testimony on this so far, could you tell us, please, how it is that children and their mothers unborn children, are exposed to these chemical flame retardants? What is it? What are the properties of the flame retardants and how is wearing clothing treated with flame retardants sufficient to cause exposure? Being in a room with furniture, I've heard it said that, it flakes off rather easily from anything that it's used in including TVs or furniture or whatever. It gets into the dust that's on the floor. Kids are playing on the floor. They're exposed to it. They ingest it. It becomes a problem. Is that all accurate information?
Every bit of that is accurate. A number of studies have shown that brominated flame retardants accumulate in dust. Anybody who's worked around little children in the age group 1 to 3 or 4 years knows that constantly, quite normal behavior, is that they play on the floor and then put their hands in their mouths and then play on the floor some more and put their hands in their mouths again. We've known for a half a century that that's how children get lead paint poisoning, the dust that arises from lead paint. And it turns out that studies that have looked at levels of brominated flame retardants in little toddlers find that levels in toddlers are 2 to 4 times higher than in older children. And it's probably almost certainly because of their patterns of behavior, their patterns of exposure.
So the same thing would apply to clothing, to car seats, to sitting on a piece of furniture?
Yeah, there's probably some degree of exposure to brominated flame retardants through inhalation, but not too great. Minimal through the skin. And I would think that the most of it for most people in the general society outside of industrial workers is through ingestion from dust from food.
Let me ask you, because I had just a little bit of a discussion with the industry folks about the precautionary principle. Where might you come down on that? Should something be proven safe before it can be used? Or do we continue in the way that we have in the past with something having to be proven that it's dangerous before we can even think about acting on it?
I've been a strong proponent for many years of reforming the Toxic Substance Control Act. As you yourself said, I consider it to be broken legislation for all the reasons that you mentioned. I've studied the European REACH legislation pretty carefully. It's not perfect legislation. I think it puts too much power into the hands of the industry and not enough into the hands of central government to oversee safety standards. But nonetheless, the overall philosophy of REACH, that chemicals have to be proven safe to some level of surety before they come onto the market, is a good one. One of the things about REACH, which is very logical and it's very sensible and it avoids the reductio ad absurdum that the chemical industry was pursuing, that you have to prove things to be less than 1 in 10 million before you can let them on the market. REACH has gradations in testing that depend upon the intended use of a product. So if a product is going to be used for military use, if it's going to be a building block in the chemical industry but not get out into consumer products, it requires less scrutiny than if it's getting into consumer products. And the highest level of scrutiny is reserved for materials that are going to get into consumer products that are reserved for the use of pregnant women and infants, such as brominated flame retardants.
2 more questions. I've heard it said that when substances treated with these flame retardants burn, let's say in a home fire, that the smoke that is produced is very toxic, and that anyone exposed to it, like firefighters, for example, is being exposed to something that is very dangerous to them. And this may be information you don't have, but do you know anything about whether that is accurate information?
I don't feel qualified to comment on that, sorry.
Okay. Last question. If every single one of us in this room was tested for brominated flame retardants in our system, what do you think the percentage would be that would have it?
Well, I've got some data that I can fall back on there, and that has to do with the fact that the CDC goes across the United States every year and takes blood samples from a statistical sample of the American population, and they find brominated flame retardants in measurable quantities in virtually all Americans.
Thank you.